thank you everybody for joining this webinar. It's excited to have so many people be able to join live, and I'm sure more will be joining as we go along. And George, I want to say thank you so much for participating and being willing to do this free webinar that can be shared with everyone, and also for being one of the live speakers for the weekends in Santa Monica. So thank you.
And at some point, you just have to keep.
And I'm going to give you just a little introduction before we kick it off, if that's okay. And I don't know if I've ever told you this, George, but I actually came across, I was introduced to you through your book, The Relationship Handbook, back in 2004. And it was recommended to me by Steve Chandler. And Angus and I were going through a massive relationship meltdown at the time. We were actually separated for a period of time. And your book was instrumental in us being able to find a way forward and get back together. So it's amazing the power that can be shared just in that way without even knowing you were working with you. And I'm so glad that you've updated that book, because you have your anniversary edition now. And yeah, because when I read the book, I didn't know anything about the principles. I didn't realize that there was sort of an understanding behind it. So it wasn't until 8 years later when I was introduced to the understanding, and you know, finally putting some dots together. And then it was 10 years later when I joined the Pransky and Associates mentorship program. And again, that experience of working with you and Linda and Barb, it was so transformative in terms of my personal life, my professional life, and even our relationship again. And so in terms of just the impact that you have in sharing this understanding, I'll just speak to it for myself, and then in a broader way what you've done in the world. But in terms of that mentorship, I went from, you know, working as an executive and really finding my footing and being able to find a way to launch my solopreneur practice, to be with my own human emotional experience, which included all of the highs and lows, in a way that had it not get in my way from moving forward the way that it had done, in a way that allowed me to not take my thinking so seriously and connect more with the inspiration that is coming from a deeper place that we all have inside of us. And I'm able to do so much more now than I was. And I'm able to do it in a way that is more lighthearted, more fun, more enjoyable. And to me, that's one of the most important things. It's not just about doing more. It's about where I'm coming from as I'm doing it and what I'm able to do as a result of that. And your program was, you know, a very powerful part of that shift inside of me. And even though, you know, after reading the Relationship Handbook, I thought that Angus's and my relationship was, you know, in a good place, it's still, I didn't realize that there was more intimacy, more connection, more commitment on my part available to me in that area. And so I wasn't even looking for it, but that just transformed our relationship in a way that was completely surprising and something that I didn't even know was possible. So it just goes to show that we don't even need to know or have a vision. It just comes through us. And then on a broader level, you were one of the first psychologists, one of the first mental health professionals to meet Sydney Banks and to have your professional work impacted by the understanding and have that transform. And you know, because of that, Colin Wilson has called you one of the greatest psychologists of our time, but you've also taken the understanding far beyond the field of psychology. And you and Linda have really been pioneers in bringing the understanding into so many different areas of the world. And you've trained so many practitioners. And that impact just continues to ripple out. So today, you know, I know that you know that the group that the Soul-Centered series is really focused on coming back to the simplicity of the teaching, the way that Sydney Banks shared it, It's not about focusing on him as a guru, but it's really about focusing on the essence of the understanding and the simplicity of that. And so I love for you to be able to just share what your experience was like meeting him and learning directly from him. And, we can just have a conversation from there. And then we'll leave some time toward the end for people to ask their questions. Does that work for you?
That sounds great, Rohini. Now we have an hour, right? Is that right?
Yeah, we have an hour.
Great. Super. So I think that's good. I'll talk a little bit, and then we'll converse, and then we'll do questions. I love doing questions. Well, before I met Sydney Banks, I thought my life was pretty good. So much so that I was doing seminars with this guy named John Enright in order to help people to have nicer lives themselves. But then when I heard about Sydney Banks and went up to Salt Spring Island to listen to him talk, because I heard these things about him that I thought were very impressive. And most impressive was the fact that all he did was talk to people. Whereas I thought, from my psychology background, you had to do something, you have some kind of a program and techniques and methods. The idea of just talking to people and they change was really something I had to see firsthand. And when I went up to listen to him talk, I went into an auditorium and I saw these incredibly mentally healthy people. They were very calm, and they were very, and yet at the same time they were very vital and had a lot of vitality. And I had never really seen calm and vitality together. I saw people being very hyped up and very energized, and I saw people. The calm people that I saw were bordering on the depression side of the ladder. So I never knew that a person could be calm and peaceful inside and yet have this energy and this vitality. So that was really surprising to me. I couldn't believe it. And then the other thing I saw was the couples were very close, but not very clingy. So I'd seen clingy couples and I'd seen distant couples, but I hadn't seen close and not clingy. And that intrigued me. This is before I even saw Sydney Banks for the first time. So I was in this room with these people, and I was already wondering, how does that possible that people could get to that place? And how could talking to people get them there? I just couldn't get it together. And I also couldn't help but notice how anxious I was in comparison to the people in the room. So I felt like, I just got out of mental institution. I was so nervous and anxious and restless compared to them. Now in the Bay Area, where I was calmer than most. In other words, I didn't see myself as very anxious. But in this company, I was really felt like a nervous wreck. So Sid came in and he talked, and it had a very quickly a calming effect on me. And I also had a lot of trouble remembering what he was saying. I heard it, but it was kind of in one ear and out the other. But it did have a calming effect on me. And afterwards, Sid asked if I would, if Linda and I would visit him at his house. Because he'd had psychologists and mental health professionals come to his talks. He knew that because people would report it. The local people would report it to him. But he'd never had a chance to talk to any of them, even for 2 minutes. They would come and leave, and they'd be gone. So the idea of talking to a person whose job it was to improve people's mental health was, he was really looking forward to that, because he had no idea. He was a blue collar worker. He was, in ninth grade education. He didn't know anything. He was revered people with PhD degrees and MD. He thought they were way from another world. He said, "Oh my God, that's so impressive that people." So the idea of finding out what a person like myself would do to help people was, he couldn't wait for that to happen. So we came to his house, and was very gracious, and he showed us around, and a lot of the people who were at the talks were at his house. They wanted to hear what we had to say as well. So he asked me what I did with people, and I told him, I took them into the past to kind of heal their memories, and I would get them to, get their feelings out so that we could help them to resolve their feelings. And we talked. I told him that we would do exercises and processes with people to get them more in touch with their experience. So we talked about all those things. And he said to me, "Well, George, it would seem to me that would be very painful for people to go into their painful memories and go into their painful feelings. I really don't see how that would be anything but really painful." And I said to him, "Well, Sid, it is painful, but it's a means to an end. In other words, it's like working out or something. You work out, and it's very hard, but then when you get done, you get the benefit of it, see?" So he says to me, "Well, did they come out the other side with that benefit? In other words, were they cured? Were they happily ever after when they came out of your seminars?" Well, I didn't even hear the question. I said, "Well, what was that again?" He says, "Well, you said they start here, and then they go through this pain and suffering, and then here, that's when they see all the benefits." And I said to him, "Well, I don't think they usually did come out the other end happy. The people who went to our seminars didn't live happily ever after." And when I had that thought, I had this sinking feeling in my stomach, and I had the thought, what is the point of my work? What, based on what I just realized, how do I justify the value of my work if people aren't coming out the other side, going through all this pain and then not coming out the other side? And I got very kind of frightened and upset and angry, and I couldn't think of any reason that I would be feeling that angry if he hadn't subtly done something to me. So I felt really duped and upset at the way he treated me. That's what happened, I'm embarrassed to say. And in my indignation, I said to him, "Well, what would you do to help people? What are you suggesting?" In the back of my mind, I was asking, well, what would a ninth grade graduate welder have to say about improving people's mental health? That's the indignation that I had, but I was toned it down in order to talk to him. And he said, "Well, I would teach people what I knew that I understood, that accounted for my own personal well-being." That's what he said. I would tell them what I understood, share that accounted for my well-being, and then they would benefit from firsthand understanding of someone who found some well-being. Well, that made things worse because I realized that I didn't have the well-being. My relationship with Linda was really not doing well. My life was a madcap, frantic and frenetic experience. But I was too proud to say that, so I said to him, well, I have colleagues, Sid, that don't have that well-being themselves. Now, how would I saw it as a technique, how would your technique or your method work for them if they had nothing to share, And he said, they're in the wrong business. If they are not themselves happy, if they don't have good relationships, if they don't enjoy their life, then they shouldn't be in that business. They should be in some other business that doesn't depend on a person sharing about their mental health. Well, that was it for me. We left, and I was really upset. And we drove down, took the ferry, and then we drove down towards San Francisco. And on the way down, I was complaining to Linda about what a charlatan he was, and how ridiculous what he said was, and how absurd it was that a person with no education would be challenging a profession that's been around for 50 years. And she said, well, why don't you just forget what he said? Ignore it. And I said to her, well, that's a good idea. But then about 10 minutes later, I said, Linda, I can't get it out of my mind. It's so ridiculous. And she said, well, if you can't get it out of your mind, there must be something that resonates with you. And that brought a sense of peace and calm to me. And I discovered that, wow, I really did understand something that affected me. And then as we drove down the freeway to California, I started having some thoughts about what I'd learned. And by the time I got to California, I was affected by the meeting and the time I'd spent up there. And I began to see the frantic, frenetic pace down there. And I began to see how stressed everybody was. And I began to see that, wow, this is amazing that he's discovered something that had that effect on the people there, and that could have its effect on the people down here. So, make a long story short, I split from my partnership with John. I gave him the practice, and Linda and myself and Karen Erica went to Salt Spring for a summer, and we learned from the people in Salt Spring, and we learned from Sid, and then we came back and we started a practice in the principles. And that was a dramatic change in our lives because we essentially lost our standard of living. We went from $80,000 a year to $8,000 a year in annual income, and yet we were happier and more secure about our finances than ever, because we had this jump in level of consciousness, and we saw that jump in level of consciousness was the way that human beings were meant to evolve. It was the way they were meant to improve themselves. It was the way they were meant to solve their problems. It was the way that they were meant to have a nicer life, was raise the level of consciousness. And I saw that even though I didn't know exactly what caused the jump in the level of consciousness, that it did happen, and I understood intuitively that it came from understanding something that I didn't understand before I had that jump in level. So I saw understanding as kind of the vehicle for raising your level of consciousness, and I saw that raising your level of consciousness was the answer to everything. Everything across your entire life would improve if your level went up. Now, I thought, gee whiz, all I have to do is sit with people, share what I understand. They will intuit what I understand because they have that in them. They have just as much freeze-dried understanding in them as I do. And then their level will go up, and then across the board, they'll have a nicer life. And I can say, I did right by these people. That was my vision. I did my job. And I thought that I really thought that the world would be a path to our doorstep, because we had at that time 4 billion potential clients. You know, there wasn't a human being that wouldn't want to have a higher level of consciousness, wouldn't benefit from a higher level of consciousness. So we had this enormous demand and this extremely small supply. So I don't know what, say 5 people as a percent of 4 billion is, but there's an awful lot of zeros after the decimal point. So I thought, this is a great thing. So that's my background. And I never, it didn't grow at a fast rate until pretty recently. Back then it was, you could have your annual conferences in a phone booth somewhere.
Well, thanks so much for sharing just what your journey was like. And I know, George, that you recently did a talk for quite a large group of mental health professionals. You mentioned that to me, and I wondered, based on what you're seeing now and where you're at, how has that evolved? Or has it evolved for you in terms of sharing the understanding? And I know that the foundation is still absolutely letting people have their own insights, waken to the realization that they have within themselves, that they have the answers. But I'm just curious what that evolution has been like in terms of the sharing for you.
Sharing with professionals.
Yeah, I know that you were at that talk recently, and so that came to mind.
Well, when I started out, Rohini, I was dedicated to getting this message to the professional community, because I thought that ultimately this was the only way people would try to help clients. I didn't know when that would happen, but I felt at some point this would be the way that everybody helped clients. There wouldn't be a number of ways. It would be one way, and that would be to share something that you understood that accounted for your well-being, and then that would raise the people's level of consciousness, and then whatever they came in for would be helped. So I went to these clinics and talked to them, and it's hard to overstate how disinterested they were and how argumentative they were. And if I found, there were 25 people, if I found 2 that were slightly interested, I was thrilled. And I would look at those 2 the whole time. And one thing I noticed that was great is I didn't care how badly people responded to it. So that really helped me out. Well, the second stage of it was, one of the directors told me to videotape clients and show the videotape so they could see that this would work with their clients. And I did that. And even though I didn't cure people in 20 minutes, you could see that they were affected by a little bit of understanding, and that they became less symptomatic. Well, over the years, I've done a lot of in-services, and I was wanting to do them in a way that didn't create resistance so that I wouldn't spend the whole time dealing with their resistance. So this one that I did in New Hampshire, I made it my goal. I'm going to get 0 resistance there. That was my goal. And I came up with the idea of not talking about the principles, not talking about a better approach, but simply talking about the fact that human beings have things, resources in them that they could use to improve their own mental health. That you weren't working with, even in the most troubled person, has resources in them that could be leveraged by the therapist, no matter what their approach was. That was the premise of the evening, of the day. And, you know, I gave some examples of, you know, what people know inside themselves. Then if they realize what they already knew, it would really help them. So I talked about people getting over themselves, getting into a bad feeling, bad experience, and how everybody gets over themselves. And if you understand that fact, you can get over yourself quicker rather than later. I talked about changes of heart, how people change their minds. It's a human potential to change your mind. Everybody has the power to change their mind. Everybody in that room has changed their mind. And if you understand changing your mind and what's behind that, you can do it more frequently. I talked about the illusory nature of life. Things aren't always as they appear, and how we all look back. It's things that we thought were very, very real 10 years ago, and we're embarrassed to think that, like when we were in high school, we saw all this social pressure, and now we look back and say, why do we feel pressured by anybody? Who cares what other people think of us? So I gave examples of the illusory nature of life. Well, people were very responsive to those things. And then I talked about therapy as education, that you could teach those things to people, and that every therapy had a message that they were teaching, and there's a philosophy behind it. You know, like Freudian therapy has a philosophy that your past is affecting you in the present moment, and that you could talk to people about the logic behind these approaches, and the logic would help them. And that would be an educational component. And Rohini, it went extremely well. People really seemed to connect with it and really liked it. And I had 0 resistance from people. And that's going to go on our website pretty soon. I'm trying to get a copy of the tape that they had put on Pransky and Associates website.
Oh, that'll be wonderful. I certainly look forward to seeing that. And I know you have your relationship training coming up this weekend. It's an in-person event, and you're also live streaming it. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about how the understanding is so powerful in terms of people getting along better, having relationships, whether they're love relationships or really any relationship. Do you have any thoughts you'd like to share around that?
I do. You know, my understanding and Linda's understanding of working with couples has had a continuous learning curve. We're so much more understand what we're doing now than we did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And 2 of the things most recently that I realized is, one thing is, if you have a model, the traditional model is I'll make sure I don't upset you more than is necessary, and you try not to upset me. So the traditional model is, trying not to upset each other with what you do. Whereas this understanding gives you the power to get over being upset, being hurt, being mad. So the understanding that couples need is, I promise to get over it when I get upset at you or angry at you as soon as I possibly can. That's the understanding, so that you can be however you are in the marriage, and you don't have to worry about the fact that, you know, the other person reacts to you emotionally, because you're committed to get over the emotional reaction, and because of the principles, you know how to do that, what's involved in doing that. So that's one thing. The other thing is, the only thing that can go wrong if you have that model is if someone's intentionally mean. So one of the things that people begin to learn is that if your intentions are good, if goodwill, commitment to goodwill, that really matters. So we work with couples. We invariably, they don't have as much goodwill as we'd like to see. You know, they have a little bit of their own agenda and getting around the other person's, what the other person wants, and their heart's not in the right place. And they kind of accept it because they feel like they live in a world where people's heart is not in the right place, and they don't think that their partner's heart's in the right place. So they feel like, well, if my heart isn't in the right place every once in a while, what's the big deal? But they begin to learn that it does matter, and that you can have an understanding where both of you will do your best to keep your heart in the right place, keep your intentions pure, or be apologetic when you're not. So that's another thing. And that's kind of an understanding that couples can arrive at that really provides a foundation for a good relationship. And then the other thing is, there are anything else that's problematic, you can have understandings about. So even though you react with these problematic things, if you have that understanding, it keeps you from spiraling. So when we work with this couple, we're going to work with a live couple during our program this weekend, and those are the kinds of things that we'll be attending to. And we feel like if you are solid in those things, you got it made. Your marriage will just get, or your relationship will just get better and better and better over time. You'll have a learning curve. And every other kind of problem we see is just a symptom of those things not being in place.
I love that. And I know that I've absolutely experienced it personally, but I think it points to kind of a general theme in the impact of the principles, which is really about not having to manage yourself, not having to manage your thinking. And that rather than that being problematic, it actually brings out the best in us. And for me, that was what really stood out as different. It took me a while to see it, but it really stood out to me as this is why this understanding is completely different than anything else that I've come across, because everything else gave me something to do, something to work on, another way to improve myself. And so I just love to hear any thoughts you have about what makes this understanding different, and if you see it that way, or perhaps you see it another way.
Well, you know, when I was in graduate school in psychology, they had a course on the developmental stages of children. And one of the things that was helpful is it showed how kids will naturally learn to do new things at different ages. And the other side of it is they have trouble doing certain things you want them to do until they get old enough to do it. So the kids might grow at different paces, but it was an eye-opener to me that it was built into kids that they will, in fact, suddenly be able to do things that they couldn't do before. And it was kind of like the model of a seed growing into a tree, or a caterpillar growing into a butterfly. Now, I had no idea that that was true of people psychologically. I thought that if you were going to improve yourself psychologically, you had to roll up your sleeves and do it. So if you weren't going to do it, who is going to do it? That's what I thought. But I didn't. When I got introduced to this, and I introduced the idea of innate health, and I began to see, no, every human being is on a growth path, and they will be able to do things in the future that they can't do very well now, like get over their reactions faster, and have a clearer mind more of the time, and come up with new thought more easily. That would naturally happen. And the only thing we have to do is tell people that it will naturally happen, and tell people that they don't have to try to make it happen. And if they do, they might be innocently interfering with the process. Like one of the things we teach couples is that you don't want to have an adversarial relationship. You want to have a relationship where both of you feel like the other person's on your side. Okay? Well, once people caught on to that, I couldn't believe how naturally they saw that and were able to preserve that and able to keep that going. They didn't need any techniques. They didn't need any help from us. Once they saw that, how people feeling on the same side really made a difference, they just took it to a higher level naturally without any effort. So everything that we would like to be will naturally happen for us. And an understanding that it all happens within the mind, and that the mind has an intelligence behind it, really accelerates the process of evolution for people.
It's coming back to that the understanding is really what counts, and that the behavior shifts as a result of that understanding shifting. And then the behavior shift is just makes sense. It's not something that requires effort or self-management. It's just the new way of doing things.
Rohini, one of the things I've realized in the last year or so is that understanding is the most misunderstood and undervalued commodity in the world. People have no idea how powerful understanding is, and how much of the heavy lifting understanding can do in a person's life. It's even people who've been involved in the principles for a long time, in my opinion, don't fully appreciate the power of understanding. And then understanding is all you need. That's enough. Human beings, when they have understanding, it's enough. Even I'm a big sports fan. The understanding, a deeper understanding of whatever sport you're playing, has infinite implications in your ability to perform in that sport. That's where the bottleneck is. They don't understand it. The top players understand it better than the bottom players, and everything else is up and down. Some of them in better shape than others. Everything else is a variable, but the people who understand the game have every advantage if they understand it more. And the people who don't understand it quite as much don't have those advantages. The same thing is true if you're a writer. If you understand, it's what empowers human being is understanding. Well, let's see if there's any questions. What do you think, Rohini?
I think that would be great. So let me just give a little bit of direction regarding that. If anybody has any questions, if you click on the participants button, then it will open up on the sidebar where you can raise your hand. And then when you raise your hand, I'll be able to see it, and then I'll be able to unmute you so you can ask your question. So hopefully that's clear. And if anybody has any questions, just click on the raise hand button and I'll be able to see it. So we'll just wait a moment while people figure that out. And if you can't figure it out, just put a note in the chat. But I think that's clear. It's a quiet group. Nobody's raising their hand yet.
It's all right. We got to give them a minute to.
Yeah.
You don't have to have questions. We can.
Yeah. Well, now that people know how to do that, we'll just give them a minute. And one of the thoughts that comes up from, oh, here we go. Richard has his hand raised. All right, Richard, so I'm going to unmute you. There you are, Richard.
Hello, George.
Oh, hey, Richard.
Wonderful as usual. You use the word intuition, which I love, because one definition is no prior knowledge, and really the essence of life, it sort of imbues that in an individual that has the experience. So you really don't need to know about what it is, what you're going to talk about. It just comes through you.
Well,
So can you talk a little bit more about that, just sort of the formless nature of that?
Well, I think the word intuition, I don't like the word intuition because it mystifies what is very natural to people. So in my mind, seeing the obvious is the same as intuition. And I think that people who go through our programs will say, well, how will I use what I've learned? Well, the way it will happen is you'll see differently. Life will appear differently to you. And that's how people, how the formless takes a form. You just suddenly you see, so you understand things, and then when you look out through your eyeballs, you see differently. So one person's intuition is another person's no-brainer, depending on how deeply they see. And I think that people aren't used to seeing different as being the way that improvement takes place. They're just not used to it. So all of a sudden they'll see someone and see them in a more understanding, compassionate light, feel more warmly towards them, and they don't realize it. That represents that formless understanding manifesting. They just understood deeper, and the result was they feel compassionate towards someone that they used to feel resentful towards. So that's something that people, it's really hard to get that across to people as much as I'd like to. And it's really hard for me to see it as deeply as I'd like to see it. So I hope that it's responsive to it, Richard.
Yeah.
I hope that sounds like an answer to what you were saying.
I know from my experience, George, is that it's sort of going into those areas that you've never experienced before. You've never done what you're asked to do, and what you need to know just comes to the surface.
Yes.
So there's that sort of aspect of no prior knowledge. You don't have to have experienced it to be very comfortable with it, to be at peace with yourself as you're just simply moving forward and giving whatever answer or whatever solution or whatever. Because I know in my creative work, that's often the case. I'm uncovering something that already exists. I'm not creating anything new.
No, that's true. That's why I like the way throughout time the masters have used the word awaken. I love that because you're waking up to something that's already there. You're not making something. You're awakening to something that's already there. I think that's what I hear in what you're saying. That people are just, it's already there. You just have to, like Sid Banks was very extreme. He said that people are, someone said to him, well, Sid, are you saying that we're already living our fate and the cards are already dealt at this level that we're at now and we just don't realize? And he said, yeah. He says, but I would say that everybody's got a royal flush hand and they don't realize it. The cards, we've already got our cards dealt. We all have a royal flush and we don't realize it. I thought that was a powerful statement.
Thank you, Richard. So the next person who has their hand raised is Barbara. So I'm going to unmute you, Barbara.
Okay.
Barbara, there you are.
So my question is, as I'm understanding this, and I'm not fortunate enough as the two of you are, they have a partner to kind of talk this out with. When I'm talking with family who they aren't coming to me for coaching, they aren't, we're friends, and they have no understanding of the role thought plays, what, oh, I'd actually advice, but, I listened to my sister complain for an hour about her mother and everyone in her world. And it was a difficult conversation to have, or to, and I just listened, but I thought, I don't want to reinforce a false belief, but I also don't know how to bring it up when she's so upset.
Oh, I'm really glad you brought that up because that is as common as crabgrass in the people that we talk to. I mean, to be really blunt about it, you don't want to make it your business what other people think and what they struggle with. You want to be compassionate of them, for sure, for your own sake. Just for your own sake, being compassionate also helps them. But if your sister, your mother is talking about how bad things are and the problems that they have, you really want to make a point of not making that your business. Now, if you don't make it your business and you're able to maintain a feeling of love and warmth towards your sibling or your relative,
My sister.
your sister, and you're able to maintain an honest feeling of warmth and compassion, believe it or not, that is the best you can do for her because you're offering humanness that will draw out her well-being like a tuning fork. So if you have a really strong positive feeling about someone, it will reassure them and draw out their health. And when their health gets drawn out, they will start to see things in a more intelligent light. Now, one of the illustrations of this is like when Pransky and Associates, when we were in our most busy times, you'd have 6 people in different rooms, and none of them were symptomatic. Even though they weren't cured yet in their first day, none of them were symptomatic. The depressed people didn't look depressed. The anxious people didn't look anxious. The angry people didn't look angry, simply because the person that worked with them maintained their bearings, kept their goodwill, and drew out the health in the person sitting opposite them. And that gave them a platform for teaching the person. So Barbara, you're that way with your sister. Like if you can overlook her, what she says and her problems and not concern yourself with it, trying to solve them, and you maintain a warm feeling, you will see her get pulled out and you will see her thinking improve right before your eyes.
Great.
And that's true for even for Linda and I. We have to make sure we don't get into each other's business, even though we're really good at helping people. I wouldn't get into Linda's business unless she asked me to. So she might come home and say, gee, I had this struggle with this person and they're this and they're that. Yeah, or I might do the same thing. And the other person wouldn't open their mouth. They would just, feel as warmly and as compassionate and as understanding as they could. And then if the person asked for the help, they would help them. Because once they ask for the help, they're going to be receptive. That's one great thing, because people's wisdom, if they ask for the help, believe me, they will receive the help. If they don't ask for the help, they're not going to be receptive.
Yeah, I didn't offer any help, but she wanted me to validate her thinking. And that's where I got a little stuck on what to do.
Well, the thing is, Barb, it's not perfect. I don't know the right word, but if you tell me that your friend is a bum and is a terrible person and we have them in common, and I don't say anything, it doesn't mean that I agree with you. And if you think I agree with you, then that would be your problem, not mine.
Okay.
You see? So it doesn't mean that but if you ask me, if you say to me, well, George, do you agree with me? This person's a bum. If you ask me, you will be influenced by my answer.
Oh, okay.
So you say, well, you think it's a bum? So I'll tell you the truth, I don't. I like the guy. That will influence you. But if you don't ask me, it's gonna muddy the waters if I say, well, for the record, I like this guy. It's just not it's not gonna go well.
Thank you, George.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you, Barbara. We have a couple more people with their hands raised. The next person is Julianne. Let me unmute you, Julie.
Hi.
Are you there, Julie?
Yes.
We can
Can
hear
you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So my question, hello?
Yeah.
Oh, hi. So Rohini's been helping me so much with this, and after her support, one of the questions that started to arise for me, like in where I see the edge of my own understanding, is that when I go into an unknown situation where like I'm stretching my skills, a lot of times what will happen is I'll think that maybe I made a mistake, and I'll start to think that a catastrophe could happen because I've somehow missed something, and then I really have a hard time tapping into well-being or wisdom. It's almost like I'm very disoriented. And so I just wondered if you had any insight around that you could share with me.
Well, my insight is that I doubt that there's a person on this call that wouldn't say that happens to them as well, including me. So it's only natural that people freak out. And when they freak out, their minds fill up with memories of previous freakouts. And they fill up with memories of when our parents told us we were a bunch of bums or whatever, So when we get down there, we get all the memories and all the thoughts that live in that world. And if you understand it for what it is, if you see that's all that's happening, not that's part of what's happening, but that's all that's happening. I've just lost my bearings. I've gotten lost. Are you kidding? If you do that, it won't get worse. and it will start to turn around. All you have to do is recognize it for what it is. If you believe in it, then it's going to get worse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very compelling.
Yeah. Well, it happens to me, Juliana, but I know that it happens to me less than it used to, which is a blessing. But it also happens to me way more than I would like it to happen.
Mm-hmm.
I wish it happened much less, but that's not my call, really.
Thank you so much.
No, you're welcome.
Thank you. George, are you okay taking one more question? We got one more person with their hand raised. Great. Sue, let me unmute you. Hi, Sue.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. It's just a quick question. Is there any way that we could purposefully, or, you know, I know the principles are not doing, but is there any way we could raise our level of consciousness in any way? Or is that just like a natural thing to happen as well?
Well, if you wanted to raise your level of consciousness, if you said, George, I absolutely want to raise my level of consciousness.
George, I absolutely do.
I would listen to a person who you see as having more understanding than you do. Like, I listen to Sydney Banks. That would be my number one call, is I would listen to Sydney Banks. If you listen to Sydney Banks twice a day, listen to him in the morning, listen to him, I guarantee you that a month from now, you would say that your level has gone up.
I love you. Thank you so much.
Honestly. Now there's other people you can listen to too. I'm not saying him, but if you can just listen to truth, whatever speaks to you as being truth, that is how you can raise your level of consciousness.
Thank you.
Now, I asked Sydney Banks once, I said, well, you can't listen to Sydney Banks. How do you raise your level of consciousness? He says, well, I hear it in life as I walk around. I hear truth, and that is like me listening to truth.
I'll email you in a month and let you know.
Yeah, I do it the lazy way. I listen to Sydney Banks. Yeah, hey, do that, Sue. Will you do that? And if you tell me, oh, it didn't help me a bit, I'd like to hear that too.
Of course, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I love listening to Sid Banks anyway, because you just get that amazing calm, just feeling when you listen to them. You know, the Long Island lectures just blow me away every time.
Oh, I love those. Well, before we get off, I'd like to say that I love the course that Rohini is doing, and I feel privileged being a part of it, because there's something about the staff that she has, the people that are doing it, all being essentially trained by Sydney Banks. There's something about that grounding that I really respect. It's a powerful thing to learn from him and then go out in the world, and I love the fact that she's gathered such original people like that. I thought that was a great idea, Rohini, to do that. I love that you did that.
Oh, thank you, George. I appreciate it. And I am so grateful that you and Linda are both part of the program. You're very close to my heart. And just for people that may not know what George is talking about, there is a Soul Centered Series 6-month program that is in Santa Monica. It starts in October in a few weeks. And there's just a couple of spots left in the in-person program, but there are some virtual participation spots available if anybody's interested in that. I've got so many questions about it that I sort of badgered Angus into figuring it out so that we could have a few virtual spots. So that's available. And if you have any questions, just reach out to me. And thank you, George, so much for your participation in this webinar. It's been so wonderful. I love hearing to you. I always hear something new and feel like I get a deeper grounding when I listen to you share. And I'm going to be participating, and Angus, on the virtual program for your couples training this weekend. So I won't be seeing you in person, but look forward to participating in that way. And I believe you still have spots available for that, do you?
I have no idea. That's beyond my pay grade. What we have going and what we don't, I have no idea.
All right. Well, if you're interested, contact Terry. That's not above her pay grade.
Yeah, and you know, Rohini, I really appreciate you having me do this. I learned so much, and I enjoy it so much, and it brings everything to life when I do these. I mean, it's you know, I experience it in my daily life, but it really highlights it, brings it to life if I have a chance to talk to people like yourselves. So I want to thank all of you for giving me this opportunity.
Yeah, thank you everybody for being here. And I'm going to unmute everybody. So if you don't like a lot of noise, you might want to get off quickly. But I just want to give everybody an opportunity to say thank you and goodbye.